Welcome to Brandon Wilborn's Fantasy Fiction Podcast, where fans of classic fantasy adventures can hear the serialized audiobooks of a fellow nerd and indie author completely for free. I'm your author, narrator, and host, Brandon Wilborn. Thank you for listening today. The story portion of this episode starts at about the minute-and-a-half mark. Last week in the Treasure of Capric, our heroes survived their first battle, though it took quite a toll on Kurian. Then when Noman tried to ordain his students, Kurian rejected the offer and left. While he was alone in the dark, he thought he saw a star, which is impossible as far as they know. This week I'll be reading Chapter 9, following that a behind-the-keyboard segment about the magic system in Pallingham. Before we start the story, I keep forgetting to let you know that there is a map to Pallingham, if you wanted to get a sense of where they're going as the story progresses. There's been a lot of travel already, and they've got a ways to go. So if you'd like to see where Kurian's at in any given chapter, I'll post the map at brandonwilborn.com/KOC maps. That's brandonwilborn.com/KOC maps, and I'll put that link in the description to make it easy for you. You might notice that I've got a little bit of a different voice here this week. Fortunately, I recorded the story portion weeks ago, so that will sound normal. But I've just got a cold this week, so my intro and outro are going to be a little bit funky. Hope you can bear with that. Now I present for your enjoyment, The Treasure of Capric. Chapter 9. The Ruins of Finn. Rhys approached Kurian while he took a moment alone behind a tree the next morning. He always tried to tell Kurian's secrets at the most inconvenient and uncomfortable of times.
"Sorry about last night,"
he said, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. Kurian shoved him off balance. "Don't worry about it.
"We've been working at it for so long, and I was wondering if I would ever make it, like you were."
Rhys shrugged.
"Didn't think it would hurt anything, since Noman was offering, and with everything that's happened. But I want you to know that we're still a troop."
"What do you mean?"
"Even though you didn't get ordained with us, I'm still your friend. You can count on me."
Rhys smiled, the way he had when they would spar to a tie during training.
"I'll follow you to the end of this thing, wherever it takes us. Tobin too, but he might be a little chummier with the Dean."
"Thank you," was all Kurian could say. Rhys slapped him on the back.
"Now let's ride some horses."
Louise had already given them basic instructions about handling the horses. They had divided the baggage between the two most troublesome mounts, including the swords and daggers, and then she had introduced each of them to the horses they would be riding. She would take the lieutenant's horse because the others were used to following it, and because her experience gave her the ability to control them. When they turned around, Kurian and Rhys were surprised to see the Dean already mounted.
"I have been on a horse in 62 years,
he said in response to their expressions. Tobin, however, had one foot stuck in the stirrup. He was hopping on his free leg as the horse skittered around the grove. For a moment they tried to suppress their laughter with snorts, but after watching Tobin hop about with one leg up in the air, Rhys bent double and roared. "Don't get cocky, boys," Louise said. "You're next." There had been a stable at the compound, but other than the few times visitors had brought their own mounts, it had been empty as long as Kurian had been there. Long ago, the Caprics had traveled across the country on horseback, but as they traveled less, they tended to remain on foot. Their horses became too old for work, and they never replaced them. Louise grabbed the leads on Tobin's horse and steadied her until he had hoisted himself into the saddle. Then she untied the remaining two and walked them to Kurian and Rhys. He had never been close enough to touch a horse, and now their sheer size was intimidating. His side was sore where one of these horses had knocked him over the day before, and he hoped the horse wouldn't remember. She handed Rhys the larger horse, a chestnut-brown mare. Kurian's was a mottled gray that shook its mane when he reached out a hand toward him. "There's no reason to be afraid of him," said Louise. "Show him you are unafraid and deserve respect, and he will do as you ask." The horse turned its head and tried to take an apple that she held out to Kurian. She tossed it to him before the horse could get it, which allowed him to feed the animal. It was satisfying to feel the crunching teeth inches from his hand.
"Let's make a deal, horse,"
Rhys said, looking into his mare's eyes.
"You don't kill me, and I won't kill you."
She snuffed at his hand, looking for an apple of her own. He grabbed one from the ground and fed it to her, then stuck his foot in the stirrup and lifted himself smoothly into the saddle.
See? Easy, Kurian.
He smiled and patted the horse's neck brusquely. She nipped at him, and Reese yanked his hand back. It was Tobin's turn to laugh at him.
At least I got up on my own,
Reese said in response. Kurian mounted without incident. The gray accepted his weight readily and didn't show any signs of displeasure. Are we ready, then? He asked. Louise untied Greta's leads, pointed her south, and patted her haunches. Go on home, she said, and the pony started walking toward Downriver Town. Finally, Louise mounted the lead horse, and they started north again. After they were all comfortable with walking, she showed them the basics of steering and encouraged them to pick up the pace. We'll not go much faster than walking ourselves if we can't get up to a trot or a canter, she told them. Along the way, they practiced moving quicker for short distances until Kurian thought his rear would never be able to survive the 240 miles to Dury. Louise gave them breaks each hour to let everyone rest, including the horses. Noman asked that they time their rests to match the liturgical hours and insisted that they return to the full office of prayers to seek God's blessings on their journey. Kurian didn't object, but he also didn't agree to join in. Whatever it is, it has to make sense for it to be significant to King Frederick and Evasius. Ancient genealogies are likely candidates. Tobin's voice drifted forward where Louise could hear every word. They had been debating Evasius's claims about the treasure being a book for most of the day, and by the afternoon, she could almost make their arguments for them. Kurian trotted beside her, riding as far from the dean as possible and avoiding the discussion. Where did you learn to do this? He asked her as she slowed to a walk. My father, she said. I was almost 12 when I lost my parents, so I grew up with the horses my father used on his farm. I helped to feed them, I cleaned their stalls, and I prepared them for work or riding. And you remember all of that from so long ago? So long? She lifted an eyebrow. You've never spoken to a woman, have you? She saw him squirm in the saddle. I don't remember what I learned about cobbling as a boy, he said, defensive. You don't really forget, she laughed, just as you don't forget how to talk to people. But when I lived at the king's camp, I helped with the horses sometimes. He keeps a few around for messengers. I guess that makes sense. He was embarrassed. She couldn't tell why she enjoyed making him uncomfortable with her comments, whether it was just for fun or something more complicated. This time, she knew he was trying to find something to get his mind off the pain of losing so much, and she felt guilty about teasing him. Why are you asking? Because riding along in silence is boring. And? He shrugged his shoulders. I'm tired of being in my own head. There's not much good there lately. Things like that always change, she said with a half smile, just like the weather. If you had something about God in that sentence, you'd sound like Tobin. Who says I didn't? So now you're going to start talking about God too? I didn't know you believed in anything but your king, he said. It stung a little because he was being defensive without understanding. You never asked, she said, hoping he wouldn't take it for more sarcasm. Suddenly, she knew he needed more than just light talk to help him handle his emotions in the moment. She patted her horse's neck and changed her grip on the reins. My dad used to tell me that the best way to drive away brooding was to go as fast as you could bear on a horse and then go faster. So, until your mood changes, how would you like to try a gallop? Kurian grinned and nodded. Follow my lead, she said. She looked back at the others, who were lagging behind, and then clucked her tongue. The horse sped up to a trot, and his horse quickly followed. After they were moving faster, she gave the command and kicked. The battle-trained horse broke into a run in the same instant. In the corner of her vision, she saw Kurian almost fall backwards when his horse took off too. After regaining his balance, he leaned forward and began to catch up to her. Faintly from behind, she heard Reese's horse neighing, and him screaming, Whoa! The wind lashed at her face and felt colder than it had a moment before. Soon tears streamed from her eyes, and she laughed for the sheer thrill of moving so fast over the plain. It had been far too long. After a couple of minutes, she slowed down. Kurian was out of breath, but held a giddy smile and kept laughing. She laughed with him because it was the first unguarded moment of joy she had seen from any of the monks, and she loved being a part of it. The others were just smudges in the distance behind them, probably a mile off. "That was incredible," he said between breaths. "You liked it?" she asked. "Let's go back even faster." She kicked with her heels and sped off toward his friends, her dark hair flowing behind like a banner, and the hoofbeats of Kurian's horse chasing after her. She hoped it was the first sound of a new friendship. They rode on for 6 days, continually north. At each break, Louise held her sunstone up to the clouds and looked through it to track the sun. Even in the heaviest clouds, the stone always picked out the sun as a bright spot in the sky. On the 4th day, they passed another crumbling village and filled their water pouches from a dirty well. The water was undrinkable, so the next morning, Louise showed them how to gather dew on extra blankets. Each night, they went to bed exhausted and sore, but by the end of the first week of riding, Kurian was finally beginning to adjust to it. He could feel the proper muscles strengthening and hardening, just as they had whenever he began a new phase of his training at the order. On the morning of the 7th day, they found the riverbed again and turned to follow it northwest. By noon, they began to see low buildings in the distance. They knew it held no more hope for civilization than any of the other villages they had seen on the plain. These were the ruins of Finn, the ancient city of kings. Finn had stood as the seat of power for 1,200 years before King Frederick found the treasure that created the Capric order. At the time, little was known about the history of Finn before Frederick's grandfather, King Heinrich III. But after establishing the order in his 5th year, Frederick ordered them to gather ancient artifacts and texts that revealed the kingdom's past. The Caprics sent many of their finds to the scholars of the academy at Finn. The knowledge they gathered helped Frederick to expand the kingdom across the 10 cities of the plain. Finn became a center for learning and culture that drew wise men and artisans from neighboring kingdoms, which further expanded its influence. The cities of the plain became wealthy from the trade that poured into the kingdom as they reached across the seas and into the north. However, Frederick's sons were not the charismatic leaders that their father was, and his grandsons fell to quarreling over control of the kingdom. In their disputes, they hired advisors from the wealthy and ambitious Evasius family. When the kingdom found itself at the brink of civil war, Shadrach Evasius, advisor to the sitting king, seized control of the army and destroyed the city from within. The city of Finn burned to the ground in a single night, and then the siege engines tore down the stones of almost every structure. It had remained empty for over 100 years. The knowledge stored in the academy was lost, and only scattered pieces of the kingdom's history survived at the Capric order. The Caprics kept histories of their order, which sometimes overlapped with the happenings of the kingdom, but not a comprehensive account of what the academy had discovered. The history of the kingdom was lost with them. With the order destroyed, the very memory of Finn would fade, and people would only remember Pallingham and the rule of the house of Evasius. As long as they feared or obeyed them, Evasius's fathers left the people alone, but did nothing for their education or their enrichment. Trade had slowed to a trickle even before clouds covered the sun and drought dried up the river. Art and culture were non-existent. Slowly, the people who hadn't fled adapted to this new way of things and lived under the gloom of Pallingham and its rulers. The Caprics retreated from an increasingly ambivalent people and lost what influence they had to make things better. Now, not even the memory of a better time would remain. They fell silent as they approached the remnants of the city. Grasses from the plain had overgrown the streets in clumpy tufts. A few cobblestones showed through the turf like trail markers to the underworld. Low walls marked the outlines of the city, and piles of stones scattered along the riverbank stood as memorials to the grand structures that once towered above the streets. In the north, darker clouds gathered, dimming the light and foretelling rain. Kurian had grown up reading about the grand city of Finn and hearing stories about King Frederick. He remembered the way that Tobin would study the paintings of the city, pointing out every detail to Kurian with fresh awe. But the kingdom and their order had failed the cities of the plain a long time ago. Now the rubble of the city barely looked like it was constructed by men. It might just as easily have been leftover pieces from a giant's game of tableau, or dropped from the sky by God. He glanced at Tobin, who surveyed the destruction with a look of disbelief. Perhaps the destruction of their own home was hitting him at last, or maybe he was remembering the grandeur of the paintings. Noman dismounted before they reached the walls and knelt for a silent prayer. Louise signaled for the others to get down and walk. It felt inappropriate somehow to ride into a place so still and empty, as if it would disturb something that ought to remain untouched. The stillness in the city was so complete that their own soft footfalls seemed foreign. Kurian strained his ears at the silence, hoping for some sound native to the city. Nothing came to his ears until a crow swooped down from the sky and landed on a crumbled stairway ahead of them. Looking up, he saw half a dozen more circling down from the clouds. He hadn't seen any birds while approaching the city, and their arrival made the hair stand out on his neck. The one on the stairs watched him approaching, then let out a single caw and leapt into the air to join its companions.
"I've always wanted to come here, but this is no longer a good place,"
Tobin whispered beside him. Kurian shook his head and looked back to the sky. The murder circling above had grown to 20 crows, and the first break of the silence had turned into a din of cackles and caws that echoed down among the stones. The noise grated on Kurian's ears, making him cringe.
"Something is wrong here," Louise said. "Be careful."
How does she do that? Reese asked. She always knows when trouble's up.
We all feel it, Noman said. The place is tainted.
No, it's different with her. We've got goose pimples, but she looks like she knows before something happens, said Reese. She did at the bridge and the apple grove. How do you do it?
"It's hard to explain," Louise answered. "Maybe you'll understand later. Now be quiet."
As they continued through the city, they passed by a row of buildings with mostly intact facades, but the empty doorways revealed only more crumbled stone behind. In places, the walls rose 2 stories above their heads, and Kurian was glad that they blocked out the sight of the crows. The wall of the last building rounded the corner of an intersection and would provide decent shelter for the night. He was about to propose it as a campsite when the crows stopped their cawing. He heard the flapping of many wings on the other side of the building, as if the entire flock were landing together. When they reached the corner, he looked toward the clouds again, but the crows were gone. A few hopped around on the ground, but nowhere near as many as he'd expected from the noise. Instead, he was surprised to see a rickety wooden shelter constructed against the wall. A small fire burned next to the shack, and soon a heavy, stooped woman shuffled outside. She tossed some crumbs to the birds and mumbled to them as if they were pets. "Oh!" she hooted when she saw them. Patches of stringy black hair clung to an otherwise bald scalp, and she squinted at them with one eye while the other drooped down her face.
"You startled me. Leave an old woman alone, won't you?"
"We don't mean you any harm," Noman said first. He was clearly as shocked as the rest of them to find a person living here.
"Harm."
She chuckled to herself.
"Just leave me alone."
This was both surprising and suspicious, and Kurian had the creeping feeling along his neck again. He didn't want to approach the woman and leave themselves in the same vulnerable position that the guards in the apple grove had taken. Tapping Reese on the arm, he pointed toward the other side of the intersection. Reese immediately remounted and moved to watch that corner. He sent Tobin to the same corner they had just turned, and then he moved around the woman's shack so that Noman and Louise stood between the 3 of them with their horses and the 2 pack mounts. From horseback, he hoped they could spot any trouble early enough to defend themselves.
"Wait,"
said the old woman from the shack, as Noman stepped closer to speak with her. She shoved a curled hand into her pocket and pulled out a rag that she coughed and spat into, then stuck back in her pocket. Then, using her finger and thumb to hold her good eye open wide in a freakish stare, she looked at each of them in turn.
"What is they?" she said. "Not phantoms like before. Not dead ones with secrets.
Such tasty secrets they has here.
Are you all right? Noman asked. We have some food and water we could share if you require aid.
Kurian turned from watching the street for a moment. What are you doing, Dean?
It's called charity, said Noman with an unusual bite in his voice. It's one of those priestly duties you've decided to forego.
The old woman let out a cackling laugh, and several of the crows mimicked her in response.
No, not phantoms, darlings, she said to the crows.
She studied them again with the eye she held open.
3 young men, monks, and 1 old one.
Her expression changed from intense interest to disappointment when she looked at Noman, and then turned to a look of expectation.
And a beautiful young woman.
The crows hopped toward Louise and made a rapid clicking noise. Kurian couldn't take his eyes off the woman now, and even the dean took a step back. Tobin and Reese were staring at her as well, instead of watching the road.
Are you hungry or sick?
Noman asked, still trying to play the compassionate priest.
Yes, very hungry, me and my dears,
she said, eyeing Louise again.
As I said, we have food and water.
Noman opened his pack and started to rummage for something to give the woman.
We can also provide care for any injuries or ailments, and we can pray for you. It must be hard being out here alone.
He was rambling, as he sometimes did when he was nervous.
You sure they real?
She said to the birds. One of them snapped its beak at her.
Noman,
Louise said, tugging on his sleeve.
I think we should leave.
Why do Caprics come to Finn?
The hag asked, as if to herself.
That is our business. We are on an important...
Noman started.
They come to join these ghosts? Bring more secrets for Duanna?
She asked, stopping Noman mid-sentence.
Finn is dead. Capric is dead.
Now, madam, why would you say such a thing?
Noman stepped away from his horse and strode toward her. Kurian felt a sense of dread and remembered that he was supposed to be watching for danger. However, the danger looked like it was right in front of them.
We seize the smoke. My darlings enjoy their feast there, she said to the dean,
then focused her attention on one of the birds cawing and rattling at her.
They can't be.
She pulled at the lids again and eyed Kurian, Reese, and Tobin more carefully. Louise stepped up behind Noman and urged him to leave again.
Right age? Maybe they is,
the crazy old hag said to the crow.
Lord Evasius wants to know these 3 come to see us.
Kurian wheeled his horse around to face the woman.
What do you mean about Evasius?
He shouted at her, but she still focused on her pets.
Yes, the heart looks tasty,
she said in response to a caw.
They all do. But Evasius doesn't like if we dally. There's treats for this news, my darlings.
She cackled again, and the crows joined her.
Tell us what you know about Evasius, said Kurian.
When she ignored him again, he urged his horse forward quickly. As soon as he was between her and Noman, she lunged at him with surprising speed and power. He lifted his staff to protect himself, but her body exploded into a mass of crows in midair. A blur of wings beat against his shoulders and head with the sound of a windstorm. Their calls were deafening in his ears, and he felt beaks and talons scratching at him for a moment before the cloud of black feathers flew past him. They circled up into the sky as they had before and headed southwest, toward Pallingham Castle. Kurian's horse was jittery and skipped to the side as the birds flew away. The other horses pulled at their reins and snorted. His heart raced, and he was suddenly parched. He patted the gray's neck and then looked at the dean for some explanation. Noman looked as shocked as Kurian felt.
That was unusual,
Tobin said, staring at the empty space where the witch had stood. I think Tobin said it well. That was unusual. Our heroes have finally discovered that their enemies are even more powerful than they really knew. How will they handle that information?
How can they fight back and beat Evasius's team to the prize? Join me next Friday as the Treasure of Capric continues. Now let's get to the Behind the Keyboard segment. This week I wanted to talk about the magic we see in the book. I've actually been wanting to talk about it for a while, but we've now met Muna and Duana, both of whom are at least somewhat in Evasius's pocket. So I thought a brief note on magic in the story made sense, but I'm sure it might come up again after a later chapter. We've seen that for Muna, the cost for her to use her magic is physical pain. Her body and half her face are scarred from her attempts to access the power she wields. Duana seems to have splintered her mind by dividing herself between multiple creatures. It's hard to tell how many of the birds are wild and how many are somewhat part of her consciousness at any given moment. The one specific power we saw from Muna was that she was able to eavesdrop on Captain Fallon after having spent the night with him. So she uses not just magic, but physical intimacy to manipulate her world and gain more power. That's not so much magic, but there are people that do that. There are two basic concepts that make up the rules for magic in the book. And rules is a loose system I think authors like to use. The first premise is that magic costs something. In this case, physical or mental pain are the sacrifices that these ladies make to gain the power to manipulate their world. That's a common enough idea in fantasy, that magic has a cost. In the case of Muna, I wanted to accentuate the personal damage that comes from dabbling in the occult. Although I wouldn't call her work dabbling, she's fully engaged. The twist that I've added is the second controlling concept to magic in Pallingham. Magic is a reversal or an inversion of the natural order. In this case, we see that Muna has hijacked the natural bond and closeness that God intended for physical intimacy in order to tap into the emotions of the other person at a distance, to be able to spy on them and then corrupt the trust that really should be there in those types of relationships. While we haven't yet seen the effect of her little procedure on Fallon, it's not insignificant that she placed her talisman in his ribs, I'll say. It just further erodes the nature of the relationship God intended between man and woman. This is probably the messiest example of that inversion idea because, to be honest, it's a messy subject to consider the sort of ties and connections that illicit encounters can create between people. That's as far as I'm going to go with that right now. The easier forms of this inversion idea come later. So, for instance, Muna at one point uses something other than a looking glass or a pool of water, for instance, to see things that are at a distance from her. Her remote viewing device is an item that's really intended for the ears, but she's turned it into a visual aid and kind of corrupted the original use. We'll see that in a future chapter. So, with that in mind, whenever we get to a magic segment, it might be fun to think about not only what the cost is to the user, but now how is it a corruption of something normal or natural? It might not always be easy to figure that out. Sometimes it's a stretch because, hey, it's fantasy and magic, and making it follow specific sets of rules is challenging. That's all I've got for this week. If you've got any comments or questions, you can reach out to me with an email or a voicemail at brandonwilborn.com/contact. I'd love to hear from you, and that link is in the description for an easy way to reach out. Thank you again for listening to Brandon Wilborn's Fantasy Fiction Podcast. Until next time, Godspeed. The Treasure of Capric is also available in print and ebook formats from all major booksellers. Find a link to your favorite retailer in the show description or go to brandonwilborn.com. That's brand on, not brand off, and Wilborn is as simple as you can make it. Wilborn. This has been The Treasure of Capric, Book 1 of The King of the Caves, written and narrated by Brandon M. Wilborn. Copyright Brandon M. Wilborn.